I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined once again by Patrick Wyman, brought to you by Bloody Elbow. I think it's been about 7 episodes or more since I've said that, but we are brought to you by Bloody Elbow. Happy to be hosted there every Wednesday morning. Sometimes a little later than that, who knows. Pat and I were just disagreeing vehemently about the status of Demetrius Johnson and John Jones' resumes, and I was quite funnily reminded of how the Heavy Hands drinking game that Luis Richard made has, I think it has Pat and Connor agree, because I think a lot of people, when they hear the show, they just think of us as like people who always get along and always have the same opinions. It's not true.
We just had a series of increasingly strident disagreements about, let's see, when did Lyoto Machida start to decline? Can you tell if a fighter has started to decline?
That transition
over a period
to
of
GSP's
a year,
last 3 fights, and when that decline began, or when it became market, or how long it took. And I think I'm also reminded of the Dalby Cummings discussion. And anyone who listened to that show only heard a very pleasant and very brief discussion of that fight. But the episode took about 2.5 hours to record.
Because we got distracted and we had an off recording somewhat heated discussion that ended with me accusing you of liking fucking weird fighters again.
Which is true, by the way. But it was like a 40-minute argument. Where we're watching, syncing up videos of Till versus Dalby and trying to find examples of whether or not Dalby is or is not good in the clinch. It's a lot of silliness. So we disagree a lot. We just we tend to hash things out and then come with a more refined version of that on the show.
Yeah, but, and then we generally have a discussion afterwards, like, Jesus, we should have recorded that. Why didn't we record that?
I know, yeah. Maybe we'll just start recording the moment we pick up a call, and then start releasing those as extras or something like that someday. But then we also talk about shit that we probably don't want to be on the air. Pat in particular has some horrible, horrible secret opinions he does not want you people to know about. And I have killed many, many men. So we just don't want to... if I don't say their names, then it's fine to say on the air. So
yeah, it's just dumpster fire. Just an off-recording dumpster fire.
Yeah. Coincidentally enough, that's how I got rid of the bodies. But
oh God.
So we're here today to talk about some fights. UFC 197 happened. Nobody seemed to really care because Conor McGregor is having contract issues, which is a little annoying, I think. I love Conor McGregor, and I like the notion that this could change things for the better for fighters. But I like fights a lot. And I think Demetrius Johnson, John Jones have some interesting narratives. I think Edson Barboza and Anthony Pettis brought some very interesting narratives into their fight. And holy hell, was it a great fight. It was every bit as wonderful as I expected it to be, even more so because, Pat, you and I'm really happy that we picked that fight correctly and called Edson Barboza, not just for the purposes of gloating. I'm going to try to avoid gloating because I think we were some of the few people who did pick Barboza going in there. But because I think Edson Barboza deserves that big win. Like, that's why I'm so happy to have called it right. Because there was a little emotional attachment going into that fight and going into my pick, where I said Edson Barboza has made serious strides. He has had some definite setbacks that would have destroyed other prospects, and to the point where it's been easy to forget that until possibly even now, you could have still called him a prospect, a fighter who was definitely still developing, still taking his lumps and learning what to do with them. And Anthony Pettis is kind of the opposite. He's like the John Dodson of the lightweight division a little bit, maybe not quite that unprocessed based, but he's gotten by so much on this dynamicism, this crazy athletic ability, his dexterity and all of that, his unpredictability and his durability, all these natural things, and hasn't really made any marked improvements, any large overhauls of his game in the way that Barboza has very noticeably. So you have one fighter who has had a tough time, and it kind of feels like the rich kid versus the poor foster child. You know what I mean? Like Edson Barboza, He came up from a rough upbringing in the UFC, and he worked and made something of himself, and it was easy for Anthony Pettis the whole time, aside from a few hiccups, but really, it was easy. He beat Benson Henderson with ease. You know, he beat Gilbert Melendez despite the fact that he didn't really seem to be prepared for the kind of fight that Gilbert was bringing to him. So I was really happy. I mean, personally, I was very pleased to see Edson Barboza carry the fight the way he did.
I'm not going to deny that it is occasionally nice to just get one stone correct.
Yes.
You know,
yes.
Like that is a really satisfying feeling. And it's not a feeling that like I tie my worth as an analyst to, because like it just doesn't happen very often.
No.
To just totally call something perfectly, but we did, and we'll get into this. I think this process versus dynamism thing more when we specifically talk about that fight. Mm-hmm. But that to me is the story of that fight. It's a guy with a stone cold perfect process who is still athletic enough and fast enough and powerful enough to be dynamic versus a guy who is 100% dynamism. In Anthony Pettis, and I think that the difference between those two approaches to fighting, both of which are viable. Both of which are perfectly viable ways to approach the sport, came through very clearly in that fight, made it really interesting.
Sure.
But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about Demetrius Johnson and John Jones. How about that, huh?
Yeah, let's do it. I think these two performances, they raise some interesting questions, some of which we just discussed before we began recording, and hopefully we can get back into them over the course of the show. John Jones came in, workmanlike, but utterly dominant performance over Ovince St. Preux. So dominant, in fact, that I think it seemed to emphasize the moment that OSP had, because he was getting so little done that he would land a good straight left, and it would be the only straight left of the round, and it would be like, ooh, he's doing okay, you know? And meanwhile, Demetrius Johnson comes in against a guy that both you and I thought might be a very interesting test for him, especially in the first few rounds. And what does he do? The guy with the longest active fight time in his division, a division not known for its finishers, goes in there and just blows Cejudo out in less than 3 minutes. So, I mean, two very different performances.
Let's talk about Mighty Mouse first a little bit, because I think we need to break this down to fully appreciate how brilliant a performance it was. So Henry Cejudo is obviously, I mean, not that you could have possibly missed this given the UFC's commentary, an Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling. He is an outstanding clinch fighter, a brutally, ridiculously strong clinch fighter who has spent years of his life wrestling with some of the most accomplished technicians in the clinch on the face of the planet. It took Demetrius Johnson 3 clinch exchanges to figure him out and finish him in the clinch. Yeah. Like, just take a second to think about how ridiculous that is. You mentioned that he's ridiculously strong, and I think he is pretty powerful. Has Demetrius Johnson always been as broad as he is? Because I feel like I've only noticed this in like his last 2 fights. The dude has a strong looking back. He's actually built like a strong man despite his size. He has put a lot of effort into his strength and conditioning program over the last 3 or 4 years. He does a lot of swimming, and I think he does a lot of powerlifting. For a very small man, I would bet that Demetrius Johnson puts up some respectable numbers compared to his fellow meatheads. Like he is a big, strong dude. He's surprisingly thick when you see him in person too. You don't expect a guy who walks around at 140 or 145 pounds to be as physically strong looking as he is, but he really is. I can tell you that from personal experience.
So let's talk about the performance then from a strategic and technical standpoint. Like you said, it didn't take him long. As we probably should have expected, the dominance came in the clinch. But I think I was reluctant to envision Demetrius Johnson easily out-clinching Henry Cejudo. Of course, Henry Cejudo's type of clinch work is not the same as Demetrius Johnson's type of clinch work. Demetrius Johnson focuses on hand fighting and inside control. And I think we can draw a lot of parallels, especially with the clinch, between DJ and Jones. Because both of them being clinch specialists, both of them prefer a lot of the similar positions and similar kinds of positions. Positions with their hands and arms and upper bodies that afford them multiple options. And I think it's because they are both such good flowchart fighters. They're both so good at working off of your reactions and And that's because they have so many different things set up to capitalize on all the different reactions a certain technique might cause. If Demetrius Johnson holds your wrist down and throws a knee up the middle and you bring that arm back to the body, he'll elbow you in the head because your arm is down, and you bring the arm back up and he'll hit you with the knee on the opposite side of the body. He's just got all of these little pre-programmed kind of ideas of how to get around how you're forced to react to what he's doing to you. And John Jones is very similar.
Yeah, so I think with Johnson in particular, it's worth emphasizing. I think he is the best clinch fighter since Anderson Silva in a very specific sense of creating openings to land body strikes.
I think he's a better clinch fighter than Anderson as far as technique. I think he is the most dominant clinch fighter since Anderson Silva.
I think he is. I think that Johnson I think Jones's takedowns add another dimension, but I think it's either Johnson or Jones as the best clinch fighters in MMA right now. And I think it's the two of them, and then a massive gulf to whoever you think number 3 might be.
I mean, both of them, there is a similar gulf between both of them and their competition to how there was with Anderson, but Anderson never had this level of technical depth to his game. He was kind of...
Let me point to the specific parallel that I was trying to get to there for a second.
Yeah, sure.
What Anderson was really, really incredible at, and remained so for years and years and years, was his ability to move your arms and move your hands around in order to create openings and angles to land knees.
Yes.
So Anderson was really good, and this was how Johnson landed his first really damaging knee on Cejudo. He snuck in, and he had an underhook on that side, but so he jacks up on the underhook, uses his arm to lift Cejudo's elbow away from his body where he had it clamped, and then snuck a knee underneath. And that was the quintessential Anderson Silva move that he would use to start these barrages. So once you can sneak in that one knee, then you have them off balance, and then the rest of your game flows from that. Then you can start moving, taking angles in the clinch, start to work to the side. It creates openings for your hand control, and then once you can start fighting hands and grab wrists, then that opens up more angles, more steps, more openings for you to put the knees in there. So Johnson used, for example, right knees to open up the shots that he actually wanted, which was the left knee to the liver. So he would throw a couple of right knees, another right knee, and then once Cejudo dropped that hand and focused on defending the right knee, then Johnson would elevate with the underhook on the other side to put the left knee away. Mm-hmm. Like, it was just a brilliant performance, but it only took him, again, 3 exchanges to figure this out. So the first exchange was basically a wash. Though Cejudo landed a few nice hard knees, but Johnson landed a nice hard right hand on the break. Mm-hmm. Second exchange, Cejudo initiated the first 2 clinches. I think that's important to note. And then in the second exchange, it was all Cejudo, and then Cejudo hits a gorgeous inside trip and takes him down. Third exchange, instead of letting Cejudo initiate it, Johnson initiates it. He comes in behind a combination, ducks down, and then instead of trying to throw another punch, he realizes he's too close. He initiates the clinch. He grabs a hold, and that's when he started putting
sort of an arm triangle tie-up. Right, if I recall correctly, the third clinch was initiated in sort of an arm triangle position, standing, that he transitioned into a collar tie and a bicep control. It was something like that. Similar to how Jones tied up Shogun before taking him down in their fight.
Yep, that was exactly it.
Okay. I think the things that fascinate me now when I look at things like this, you're absolutely right. Like the way that Demetrius Johnson threatens different weapons and mix things up is wonderful. But the things that interest me most are what you pointed to with, for example, flaring the elbow on the underhook to clear the path to the body. And that is why I think the Anderson comparison is really strong, because if I just look at, I would love to make a list of all of just compartmentalize all the positions that guys like Demetrius Johnson and John Jones put themselves in the clinch. Not necessarily find themselves in, because sometimes they'll be outpositioned or somebody else will initiate, but immediately when they have the choice to establish a position, it seems like they're always vying for inside control or control of a limb. In different ways than wrestlers do. I think you very rarely see Jones and Demetrius Johnson go for body locks or waist cinches, double underhooks, double overhooks, things like that. And even in Jones's case, you very rarely even see him go for underhooks. And Johnson too. Johnson often, rather than going for an overhook when his opponent has an underhook on him, he will fight it off by creating space with his hand, or he'll sort of do an overhook to a same side crossface to push the head away, rather than just tying up with the overhook in a typical wrestler's fashion. And I think all of these things are designed to keep the hands free, keep your own hands and arms free. You know, if you have an overhook on someone rather than an underhook, you can bring an elbow down over the top. If you have wrist control, you can pull their arm aside and shoot a takedown, or you can pull it aside and shoot a knee to the body, or you can throw, as Jones so often does, an elbow to the jaw before they get a chance to recover their hand. Or as Jones and Demetrious Johnson both sometimes do, you can let go of the wrist and then hit them in the body when they bring it up because they expect to be hit in the face. There's all these things you can do when you keep your hands free and mobile and tie up the hands or move the hands and arms of the opponents. And all of that comes from controlling the inside. Having the wrists, having both your palms on the bicepses of your opponent, having them in the collar tie position, or being ready to pummel under from an overhook so that you can frame against the chest. Having access to the center line of the opponent's body seems to be the priority for guys like Demetrious Johnson and John Jones, and I find it so fascinating to watch them always negotiate those positions and use them. And they know how dangerous they are. Like Demetrious Johnson in this fight, he used those openings right when he knew he could make them.
It's interesting the way that you're talking about this, because I think that that's exactly how Greg Jackson would talk about those positions, because they're nodes, right? Like they're the points from which everything else can flow in the flow chart of possible options in the clinch.
Okay, yeah,
right?
I've heard you mention the nodes thing before. That Jackson.
Yeah, so that's how Greg Jackson thinks about fights. Is he thinks in terms of the positions that you have to control, whether it's a wrist, whether it's a bicep, whether it's a particular position on the ground, whether it's a particular position in the cage, that those are the points from which all of your other offense flows. And I'm sure that that's exactly how he teaches it to Jones and how Jones thinks about those in the clinch. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what Matt Hume's terminology is. He doesn't give a ton of interviews and he doesn't talk a whole lot, so it's kind of hard to say. Someday I will track Matt Hume down and get him to spill the beans on these things.
Just from an outsider's perspective, you could probably say that Matt Hume is like Greg Jackson without the personality. You know, he's like, in terms of like strategizing and game planning, he's like Greg Jackson, but he doesn't go into a lot of psychology and stuff like that. I think he's just like a stern taskmaster type. But
when we go to break, I will tell you the best story I've ever heard about Matt Hume, which involves Jordan Breen, Josh Rosenthal, and Matt Hume.
Oh, see, now we got to sell an extras thing. We have to allow people access to this. $100, and you can listen to this amazing Matt Hume story. I know everyone in the MMA sphere is scrambling for illicit tales of Matt Hume's goings on. But yeah, I think that's really interesting. Greg Jackson talks about stuff like that. I've been thinking about that ever since I started looking at these guys leading up to the event, because I wrote for anybody who didn't see my article, and that's actually a lot of you because Conor McGregor exists. My pair of articles leading up to 197, it was about Jones and Johnson, because I think they're both brilliant transitional fighters, and I think it's, but unlike guys like Jose Aldo, I don't think Jones and Johnson are super comfortable on even footing. You know what I mean? They like to be outfighting where they're safe, or pressuring where you're reacting to them. They don't like to be like Jose Aldo where they're countering and moving in the pocket and letting you kind of do what you want so they can teach you a lesson for trying it. They're more strategic, more preparation-based fighters, but they're great in transitions because what I noticed is that they put themselves in positions where they have transitions open to them.
So I think it makes sense to treat them as a pair, not only because they're in some order by a really long stretch the two best pound-for-pound fighters in MMA, but because they are so similar in the way that they approach things. And I think you hit on a couple. The other that I would point to is the extent to which they get better as fights go on, in very similar ways, too. Like, they both have these flowchart approaches to fighting where any information that you feed them, they're going to process and come up with specific responses to that. Jones, I think, is more organic in terms of doing that with single techniques. I think Johnson is better at doing that with sequences of complex techniques blended together. But both of them, like, I went back and I listened to corner commentary from their coaches, to the corner audio from their coaches in their corners between rounds, and it's striking the extent to which they immediately follow up on the advice their coaches give them, and how sharp their coaches are in analyzing what's happening and coming up with the proper responses.
Yeah. they're a masterpiece, really, both of these guys, of not just as fighters with their mentalities, they deserve all that credit, but I think, too, they're great examples of the collaborative effort that goes into making a fighter great, because both of them have these really cerebral teams behind them, and they really have this excellent system of preparation that they bring into every fight, and that's why they're so dominant. Why even in a performance in which Jon Jones kind of feels disappointing because he doesn't blow out an opponent who is not a worthy title challenger, he still wins 50-44 on one of the judges' scorecards. A disappointing Jon Jones fight is an utterly dominant decision. So,
yeah. So as far as that Jones fight is concerned, do we want to keep talking about that, or do we want to take a little break here and come back?
Yeah, let's take a quick break. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to talk about that. We'll try and wrap that up relatively quickly so we can get into Barboza Pettis, because I think there's a lot of things we can say about that fight and what a brilliant performance it was from Barboza. And a lot of people are curious to know what it means for Anthony Pettis going forward, if there's some meaning they can derive from this, or if he has declined in any notable way. So Jones versus OSP next, and after that, Anthony Pettis, his fate, and the man who may have killed him. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. Alright, so we are very excited to talk about Anthony Pettis and Edson Barboza and where both of these guys go from here and what led them to this point. So we're going to try to get over the Jon Jones Ovince St. Preux fight relatively quickly. I was saying before, Pat, how no one seems capable of having moderate opinions anymore. I'm always striving for moderacy, and I think the correct opinion to have of this fight, if there is such a thing as a correct opinion, is that it's a little disappointing that Jon Jones didn't go for the kill, but I totally understand why he didn't do it, and it was a completely dominant performance anyway.
Yeah, he pitched a 50-45 or 50-44 shutout against a consensus top 10 fighter that he had 3.5 weeks to specifically prepare for.
Sure.
Who's an infinitely different kind of stylistic challenge from Daniel Cormier, and a lot of the things that he worked on for this fight were not things that he could use against Ovince St. Preux. Like, they just weren't. So I think Jones kind of kept it in second gear all night. There was one point where he really turned it up and tried to finish when he got St. Preux to the ground at the end of, what was that, the fourth round?
Yeah, end of the fourth.
Balled him.
I was watching and I was like, oh, finally, it's over. And the guy sitting next to me at the bar was like, nope. And then the horn went off. I was like, ah, shit, I wasn't watching the clock. I was waiting for that moment, and it was too late. Too little, too late.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think it's perfectly reasonable to think, like, okay, that was a little bit disappointing.
Sure.
But I think it also helps us it behooves us to understand why that is. Why was this a little bit disappointing? Why did Jones do the things that he did? And I think it's fairly clear that he spent more time watching and waiting than he should have, and that's probably the rust.
Yeah, I think ring rust is a thing. I think it takes a little while. I mean, Jon Jones, look at Khabib Nurmagomedov. Look at Carla Esparza. We've had a lot of fighters lately who, despite not all of them being very comfortable in exchanges, like that Carla Esparza would have lost to the Rose Namajunas she fought 2 years ago. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no question.
And when she got into her groove, she looked okay, but she was very tentative at first and very unsure with all that pressure on. And we know how Esparza has dealt with pressure in the past in the Jacek fight. And Jones and Nurmagomedov, they were the same. Like, not sure of their range. They're standing 5 feet away from someone. Neither of them can hit each other, but they're still kind of reaching out. They're like, is this what it feels like to be in striking range? I don't remember, you know?
Yeah, and no amount of sparring is going to get you to that point.
No.
Particularly in Jones's case, when you're fighting a 6'3", 235 or 240 pound guy, who happens to cover distance
exactly.
really, really,
That's
really
what I was
fast.
going to say, especially a guy like OSP who is going to recklessly cover distance at great speed. Like, you don't know what the comfortable range is really with OSP, because not only does he have arms almost as long as John's, but he will fling himself. I mean, Barboza ran into that with Pettis a few times too. A guy who was willing to fling himself, like, yeah, he's going to be there to be countered, but you still don't want to get hit by that first shot if you don't have your measure yet.
Yeah, exactly. This was, I mean, there's a football equivalent for this would be like running a conservative offense where you have a lot of running plays and some short passes. There was nothing. John Jones did not throw anything down the field here. Like it was I wouldn't say it was a risk averse performance. But it certainly minimized Jones's risk. I don't think that he was like shying away from danger, but he certainly tried to minimize it.
It was relatively risk averse compared to like the Cormier or the Teixeira fights. But by this, that's why it was disappointing and not awful, because by the standards we've come to expect from Jones fights, it was risk averse. But he was mitigating risk for a guy who he felt was very dangerous, who was very different. I think it serves to underscore how dependent Jones is, or at least how dependent he feels he is, on being well prepared for an opponent. And you start to, looking at this fight, you start to really understand why UFC 151 didn't happen and why he didn't fight Chael Sonnen on short notice.
Yeah, I think he is a very planning dependent fighter, and like I certainly got that feeling just watching him do his training. Like he's in there working on some basic stuff in between fights, and he's helping guys like Andrei Arlovsky train. But for the most part, his training is opponent specific. Mm-hmm. Like in camp, everything he is doing for a particular opponent. Every pad session he does is for a particular opponent. The training partners that he and his coaches bring in are for a particular opponent. Like he had Yoel Romero come in to work with him for this camp. You wouldn't have Yoel Romero come in to work with you if you're fighting Ovince St. Preux. You have him come in if you're going to fight Daniel Cormier, and you need a short, stocky wrestler who really likes big clinch takedowns and single leg lifts.
Yes, but you would definitely have Yoel Romero in your camp if you were planning to listen to what appears to be National Geographic narration about lions while the Cuban wrestler makes mean faces in the back seat. Would you agree with that?
So I tweeted this Instagram video yesterday from Yoel Romero's account, and apparently that is Christopher Walken talking about lions in the background. That's Christopher. So it's Christopher Walken talking about lions over the sound system in Jones's car, while Yoel Romero in the back seat is making lion faces, and I can only assume growling. Like a lion. And
Jones just stares stone-faced into the camera. The Christopher Walken also appears to be saying near the end of that clip that the lion is so hot. So I don't know what's going on.
Well, I mean, can you think of a more quintessentially John Jones moment than having Yoel Romero in the backseat growling while Christopher Walken talks about lions? We have talked about this before, but John Jones is a weird motherfucker, and that has nothing to do with fighting. He is just a weird dude.
He is the inheritor of the Anderson Silva legacy, in no way more so than the fact that he is almost, if not more weird than Anderson Silva.
Do you remember when he showed up to the fucking Cormier fight with his goddamn Savannah cats in tow?
No, I don't remember that.
Like, yeah, he brought his freaking Savannah cats to the Cormier fight with him, like he's walking through the airport with an animal carrier that's holding one of his freaking exotic cats.
Oh, it's great.
I mean, so anyway. I love it. Like, this is what combat sports offer over other sports, is a preponderance of these incredible personalities.
I'm going to have to try to remember to link that video in the post, because it is essential viewing to understand the context of this episode.
Don't even just link it, Connor. Embed that motherfucker and let everybody see the glory of ridiculousness.
So the one thing I do want to talk about really quickly before we get off of John Jones, I think there's a bit of ring rust. He seems really dependent on preparation, the switch of opponent in so many ways. You go from a wrestler who throws volume and is small to a tall and long power punching southpaw with bad wrestling. So it's a very different type of opponent. And by the way, OSP wrestling looked pretty good in this fight early going. I think it seems like it was all he worked on in the camp, is just to avoid being taken down.
I mean, St. Preux looked as good as you could have possibly hoped. Like,
sure.
He was fighting not to lose, but which is not easy against John Jones. But he he managed to do about as well as anybody thought possible.
He played a survivalist game very well, and I can't fault him for it, you know? And I think maybe it gives him a little shine. I think he came out of this loss looking fairly good because he survived 5 rounds on 4 weeks' notice with arguably the best fighter on the planet. So, but I do think that the final thing I wanted to talk about is, and just very briefly again, is how Jones... The difference between fighters like Jones and Demetrius Johnson, I think you will probably say this is because of strength of schedule. But I also think there's a bit of a change in mentality between these guys. John Jones is not the same type of fighter in the techniques he likes to throw and how crazy he likes to be. He was like he was an Anthony Pettis type in his early career with all the bizarro shit he would do. And recently he's gotten more aggressive, but not that reckless. Meanwhile, I think Demetrius Johnson has gotten a lot meaner since winning his title, and we've even seen that in his rematches, the 2 rematches he's had in his title reign, because both in the obviously the Joe Benavidez rematch and the John Dodson rematch, they were far crueler, more one-sided performances than the first fights were. And so I'm wondering what you maybe think the difference is between these crazy dynamic fighters like Jose Aldo, John Jones, and George St. Pierre, and Benson Henderson, who are just renowned for these fun, crazy back-and-forth fights and all their wild techniques. They become champions, and they become kind of risk-averse, kind of cautious, and then a guy like Demetrius Johnson, or maybe guys like Rafael dos Anjos or Fabricio Verdum, who, like, the closer they get to the elite level, the meaner they get, and the more desperately they want to get their opponents out of there.
So I think it is possible to become meaner over time. I think we've seen that very clearly.
We've talked about this with Rafael Cordero fighters in the past, how he trains meanness, he trains killer instinct into his fighters.
Yeah, and I think it's entirely possible that Demetrius Johnson was not a guy who used to be wired like that and has become so through years of hard training and head trauma.
And I think that perhaps years of not getting the respect he deserves.
Yeah, I think it's entirely possible that can change your personality and that you can hone those instincts too. You get enough sparring sessions where you crack enough guys and you've got your coach screaming, finish him, finish him, finish him, while he's watching you, which I would imagine Matt Hume does, because that's what good coaches should do. When you see your fighter hurt somebody, what do you tell them? You tell them to finish, right? Like that should be an instinct that you can and should hone. So I think that's part of it, but I think in Jones's case, like, he comes from a camp that is notorious for producing risk-averse fighters at the highest levels. I don't know that that's entirely fair to Greg Jackson and to that camp, but it certainly seems to be a trend.
Well, this fight was for Jones was certainly in the proud tradition of Condit versus Diaz.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, this was the best way for him to win this fight, and in the broader context of Jones's career, this was necessary. Why? Because he has a UFC 200 headliner against Daniel Cormier on the line, and you don't want to get injured. You don't want to risk that fight for the sake of trying to put on a better performance at a pay-per-view that not that many people really cared about.
But,
you know what I mean?
But which is actually safer? Is it safer to spend 25 minutes with a guy controlling him and keeping at range, or is it safer to get a guy out of there in under 3 so you minimize the time he has to figure you out and hurt you, or does that depend on the opponent?
I think it depends on the opponent. I think in this case, against a big, strong, powerful guy who's a really sneaky good counterpuncher, and who didn't seem to get tired. I think the plan here was to wear St. Preux down, and then when he got tired, then you go for the kill. But St. Preux, unlike most of his performances, just never got tired here. Mm-hmm. So I would imagine that St. Preux showed them some things that they weren't ready for.
Yeah.
And I think he did some shit to confuse them. He never seemed to get tired. And that kind of screwed it a little bit. But in general, my answer is going to be finishing.
He didn't throw nearly enough to get tired, and that may have thrown him off too. Perhaps they expected OSP to be a little more desperate and aggressive given the opportunity. And if they were going to,
I think they figured on that. I think they also figured Jones would be able to get him into the clinch more, and in the clinch that Jones could wear him down. But St. Preux did a really good job of making it difficult to get into that space.
Yeah, he fought Jones's lead hand. He circled off the fence consistently. He didn't accept any clinches. He actually did a pretty good job, strategically speaking. So, okay. Let's talk about Edson Barboza and Anthony Pettis, because this is what I'm dying to talk about, and I think we may go a little over on this segment here, but that's okay, because this fight was utterly fantastic. If you haven't read the article I did today, guys, I implore you to go and check it out. It's called Warriors Discipline, How Edson Barboza Beat Anthony Pettis at UFC 197. Personally, I think the most perfect performance of Edson Barboza's career. Even having picked him going to the event, I didn't envision him basically doing it this flawlessly. Didn't get hurt, didn't really have any difficulties. Pettis had an okay second round with a few moments that took a little adjusting from Barboza, but really the fight was... the intent behind everything Barboza did was perfect and brilliant. Mark Henry and Barboza put together this, and I guess I got to give credit to Ricardo Almeida too, put together what seems to be a really brilliant game plan and have turned Edson Barboza into a really tactically sound, a process-driven fighter who knows how to adapt. He has the tools that allow him to adapt. The big focus of my article was on the counter jab he kept throwing, because every time Pettis came at him with that jab, he'd parry it, he'd slip it, and he'd return with a jab. So by the end of the first round, Edson Barboza, even if he was going to have trouble with Anthony Pettis, he couldn't possibly at that point, because he had caught Anthony Pettis' jab and touched him with his own so many times that he knew exactly he could feel where the extension of his jab was, the message that his eyes were giving him and that his body was telling him as he touched Pettis. Those were perfectly synchronized. They were in sync. And I think people don't understand how difficult it is to actually get distance in a fight. It's very, very tricky, especially when your nerves are going. I mean, let's go back to the Carlos Esparza fight. How far apart do you think Carlos Esparza and Juliana Lima were standing in the first 2 minutes of that fight?
Jesus, man! Like you couldn't have covered that distance with a freaking cannon.
You could have laid 3 Carla Esparzas down between them. They were pawing at each other from this huge distance, and I think from Esparza it was because of that ring rust. But she was not comfortable, and she couldn't tell with her eyes if she was close enough to be hit or to land a shot or to shoot it for a takedown. And so Barboza needed that tactile feeling. He needed to touch Pettis and say, okay, this is what it looks like when he's close enough to be touched, or this is what it looks like when he's close enough to touch me. And Pettis didn't do these kinds of things. And so as the fight wore on, Anthony Pettis is overextending, he's reaching, he's going for a few desperate shots. There's so many examples in this fight where if you just freeze it as Anthony Pettis throws a punch, Barboza is just out of range, but perfectly in his stance. Anthony Pettis is just trying to reach Barboza, and his stance is trashed. It's gone because he's flung himself out of it. And that's why Barboza was so capable of countering Pettis with that left hook over and over, and the inside leg kicks in the third round. Like I could go on all day, obviously, about this fight, but I want to hear what you have to say about it, Pat.
Okay, so I want to focus on what you mentioned earlier about process.
Yeah.
Because this fight was the essential encapsulation of process versus dynamism. Like Barboza, despite the fact that he's very fast, he's very strong, he hits very hard, is essentially at the end of the day a process-driven fighter. He's trying to score points, and if one of those happens to finish you, he gets you in trouble. He manages to land one of those big spinning kicks. That's great, but he's trying to score. He's trying to win rounds. Anthony Pettis is the essentially dynamic fighter. He is trying to finish you either with a strike or with a submission, and he's not too worried about scoring. And attempts by his coaches to get him to care about scoring seem to fall on deaf ears, ears that just don't understand what he's asking them to do.
This is kind of the strategist versus tactician angle, right? Like Barboza goes in there. He does things for reasons, Everything that Barboza does has an intent behind it. He's doing things because... Why? Because it will lead him to win the fight. Anthony Pettis sees openings and attacks them. He's completely tactical.
Yeah, he's trying to... Anthony Pettis does see openings. But the difference between a process-driven fighter and a dynamic fighter, I think, is the extent to which you expect those openings to come to you and the extent to which you try to create openings.
Sure, yeah.
And I don't think that Pettis has ever done a good job of creating openings.
No.
I think that he's great at exploiting what's there, but is not so good at making those openings happen if they're not there to be had. So when it comes to process, there are two things between the two of them that I think we should focus on. So the first is Barboza's volume and scoring. Pettis actually landed, I think, more head strikes than Barboza did over the course of the fight. I think he outlanded him by 5 or 6 Let me just pull up the exact number here.
You go on. I'll find it. I'll find it.
Pettis landed 35 strikes to Barboza's head. Barboza landed 27. So, but the difference was Barboza landed 15 body shots and 31 leg kicks, while Pettis landed 8 leg kicks and 5 body shots. So that does what is that when we put that out over the course of the fight? That's about 2 more leg kicks per minute that Barboza's landing. That's about 1 body shot a minute that Barboza's landing that Pettis isn't. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't sound like all that much. It doesn't sound like something that you really need to take into account. But when you play that out over the course of the fight, that's a body jab. That's a counter right hand to the body. That's two of those inside low kicks. And you saw Pettis' leg by the end of the fight. It was the stuff of nightmares.
Yeah. You know? It was worse than Uriah Faber's leg against Jose Aldo, and it only took Barboza pretty much a round and a half to do all that damage. Pretty scary.
So when we think about that as process, that's 2 inside low kicks and 1 body jab a minute. That doesn't sound like all that much. It doesn't sound like it's all that important, but it's the difference between winning and losing the fight. Yeah. Had Barboza not done that, Pettis might have taken a very tight decision. It would have been very close.
And we can't ignore the impact of that body and leg work from Barboza on the head attacks he did land. He may have landed 8 fewer than Pettis, but I think everyone can agree he landed the more impactful shots to the head. He landed harder when he landed, and it's because he was so intelligently mixing up his attack. There are 2 sequences like this in the fight that I can recall off the top of my mind, because I went through this fight on Sunday and just took a bunch of notes because I was so excited to write about it. The one example, though, that I think was really, really profound was shortly after Barboza landed a really big left hook to the body and a right kick to the body right after it. It was in the slow motion highlights after the fight and after the second round, which I believe is when it happened. And just before that, he landed a body jab as one of his jab counters. He landed a right hand downstairs after Pettis touched him with a jab. And so he was working the body and had opened it up. And he lands this big right body kick because he was having a little bit of difficulty finding Pettis' head. Pettis was adjusting to the shots upstairs and moving out of the way and not sticking around in the pocket long enough to be tagged by Barboza's combinations. And Barboza's body work was great, but he followed up on it so beautifully because he comes forward, he does a really quick feint. So basically, Pettis knows that this is a feint. He knows something's coming afterward. He knows he has to brace himself or get out of the way, and he's not in a position to get out of the way. So he checks with his lead leg. He does a cross check to try to catch the right body kick that just pummeled him about 20 seconds before, and he gets blasted in the chin by a wide right from Edson Barboza. And I think that's like the most profound example of how in concert Edson Barboza's attacks were. That everything was really building off of other things. And that was not the case for Anthony Pettis. If that's an example of process, of things belonging, of things happening in a systematic way, then Anthony Pettis didn't have that. You know, he didn't put the volume out there, but he wasn't really building things off of other things. He wasn't landing his right hand and then finding the opening off of it. And even when he could, like, Anthony Pettis is just not as technical a striker as Edson Barboza. His fundamental technique is not there. So when the 2 traded left hooks in the near the end of the first round, Anthony Pettis came out far worse because Edson Barboza knows how to throw a hook, and Anthony Pettis only knows how to throw a hook if he's like lunging forward and you're afraid of the right hand that he just threw at you. You know what I mean? He doesn't know how to throw. Yeah. He doesn't know how to exchange lefts safely or with power. The weight transfer wasn't there. The head movement wasn't there. It was just like he's slapping him with the left hand. And meanwhile, Barboza just rips a shot right through his chin in response and gets his head out of range in the process.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that difference right there, that you can encapsulate the entirety of that in the difference in their footwork. Right? That superficially you might look at Anthony Pettis and say, well, he moves well. And you think, well, if somebody moves well, then they must have good footwork. But Pettis doesn't move well. He moves a lot, but that's not the same thing. Like, I will say this for Pettis. One of the things that he did better in this fight than he has done in the past is that he did not stand in front of his opponent after he threw. He did not stop and admire his work in a way that he has in the past, and that was an improvement. He also threw more than he has in the past, so let's give Pettis credit for trying to shore up some of the things that have been weaknesses for him.
But like in the Alvarez fight, but these are kind of like, these are workarounds. These are Band-Aids in a way. You know, Pettis can throw more, but if he doesn't know how to throw combinations well, and if he doesn't know how to set up the more volume that he's throwing or protect himself while he's throwing it, then it's going to be hard to just make the volume itself work.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It is a Band-Aid. And what is the actual issue here? Pettis has terrible footwork. That's the actual issue. He has terrible footwork, which makes it really hard for him to do what he wants in terms of controlling the space of the cage. So you talked before about him relying on you being afraid of his strikes to avoid pressuring him or to force you to move backwards. That's because he doesn't know how to use his feet to do those things, right? Yeah. Like he relies on you being scared of him to move back. He relies on hitting you with the counter shot to get you to move back to stop pressuring him instead of being able to use his feet to get away from the fence. Yeah. Like we were discussing this before we went back on air. I genuinely don't think Anthony Pettis knows how to pivot. I really don't think he knows how to do it.
Which is crazy. We can talk about the reasons for that because Sergio Pettis definitely does. And Sergio Pettis is far and away a more technical, but also a less durable and therefore I think a less confident fighter than Anthony Pettis. And can you take the showtime out of Anthony Pettis? Can you make him a fighter who doesn't what did you say before, Pat, about giving him Henry Hooft and having Henry Hooft just scream at him and burn all the personality out of him and make him cry in the gym and tell him not to quit because that's Henry Hooft's special move.
Yeah, but just could you have Pettis do nothing but partner drills over and over where he's throwing 2-3 low kick, 2-3 low kick, 2-3 low kick, 2-3 low kick, and 2-3 low kick pivot straight right,
or just catch jab drills, or like restricted left hand only drills, or like body shots only drills. Like, could you have him do that, and would it make him better, or would like taking the showtime element, would taking the need for flair out of Anthony Pettis, would that hurt his confidence and make him a worse fighter?
I genuinely think the answer is that would make him worse. Yeah. I don't think that would make him better.
We talked about this recently regarding other fighters, but it's like Anthony Pettis is a finished product, and he's got his flaws, and he's got the things that make him good. But he's just he's a known commodity. And so I think that a lot of the things he does will still work against a lot of fighters, but having seen now 3 fighters take 3 very different approaches to Anthony Pettis, and all of them succeed simply because they did not fear or respect his counters, because they did not let him get away with keeping his back to the fence, and they exploited the fact that he didn't know how to get out of that position, or in the case of the third round against Edson Barboza, that he didn't know how to pressure, which both Duke Rufus and Greg Jackson were trying to get him to do. And Anthony Pettis' version of pressure is to walk forward and get countered because he doesn't know how to cut off the cage. He'll follow you, and he doesn't know how to defend himself while moving forward. He needs you to respect what he has to offer. You need to be in awe of showtime. And so I think if you take that away from him and just make him this fundamental fighter like his brother, then he might end up looking a lot more like his brother. Easier to hurt and easier to scare off, and less focused, and maybe even, as Robbie Lawler has seemed at times, bored at times in fights because he doesn't get to do what makes fighting interesting to him. So it's a complicated issue, I don't really know where Anthony Pettis goes from here.
So I think I have some thoughts on this. I think that the best guy to look at if you're thinking, okay, is Anthony Pettis done or not as an elite fighter? I think look at Junior Dos Santos and what Junior Dos Santos did in his last fight. It isn't that Anthony Pettis needs to forget that he's Showtime. Anthony Pettis needs to learn better footwork. I think it's that simple. I think if you teach Anthony Pettis how to pivot, how to stay away from the cage, how not to panic when he's getting backed up, how to pressure effectively, all the things that Junior Dos Santos showed when he fought Ben Rothwell that he had struggled with before. And we can argue about the extent to which Junior Dos Santos is some markedly different fighter or not. I tend to think that one little shift makes him a different fighter. I think if you do that for Pettis, if Pettis goes and he works over and over again with Brandon Gibson in the cage at Jackson's, does all of his pad work in the cage with Brandon Gibson, walking him down and cutting off his angles and forcing Pettis to use tight footwork to get away from the fence. Like, I think that Pettis is a markedly better fighter. I genuinely think that he can still be a top 5 guy. Going to be a champion again? That I'm going to say no. I don't think that he can be, because I don't think that there's any way ever that Anthony Pettis beats Khabib Nurmagomedov.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this, whereas I think Edson Barboza might, because it takes that footwork to deal with Nurmagomedov. Well, hopefully we'll be able to talk about that sometime in the future. But I'm with you, because a lot of this sounds like we are shitting on Anthony Pettis. You know, like, he's this known commodity. He has bad footwork, but like look at how much success Anthony Pettis has achieved despite these shortcomings. And these have been things that have troubled him forever. Like when Bart Palashevsky beat him in 2009 at WEC 45, pretty much taking advantage of the same things that people are taking advantage of nowadays. He just didn't back down. He got in his face, and didn't fear his striking, and came after him and countered him when Anthony Pettis threw, and made Pettis fear throwing the strikes that he expected Palashevsky to be afraid of countering. And it worked back then. He got a split decision over Anthony Pettis.
Kind of a robbery.
Sure, but he gave Pettis a tough time. He gave him a very tough time as a pretty untechnical fighter. But, you know, Bart Palashevsky's not a pretty fighter. He's certainly not. He's not Ben Henderson, who Pettis beat a year later. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah. So I think the underlying reason why I think Pettis can make a turnaround is because Pettis has only ever lost by decision. He has taken some tremendous beatings. Mm-hmm. Like, he took a tremendous beating from Rafael dos Anjos. Edson Barboza put a pretty freaking good beating on him, and Pettis was still there. Pettis is a tremendously tough, tremendously durable guy. Maybe not in training. We know about his injury woes, but in the cage, he is really, really tough. And I think that if he can stay healthy for even a year, if he can stay in camp, if he can work on his fundamentals, if he can stay interested, then suddenly I think maybe a couple of fights against guys who aren't at this elite level, and Anthony Pettis could be ruining guys in the top 5.
A guy who can learn to, I realize the mentality behind these two things is very different, but a guy who can learn to jump off the cage and strike somebody in the face with his leg in not one but 2 different fights, both against Cerrone and Henderson, has got to be capable of learning how to pivot. He's got to be, like, physically, he has to be capable. He's got enough dexterity to do some much more difficult things. The challenge is going to be getting him to use those things in a fight. Because for all we know, Anthony Pettis has been drilled on these things. Duke Roufus was talking to him about, putting up numbers and not expecting the result with the right hand during their fight, not looking for the knockout. And Duke Roufus has given Anthony Pettis a lot of advice throughout his career that he has had difficulty following. And obviously with Sergio Pettis existing, Duke Roufus is capable of turning out a process-driven technical kickboxer. So, we don't really know how well Anthony Pettis can pick these things up from a mental perspective, but certainly with a coach, maybe Greg Jackson can help him out here, with a coach who understands his mentality a little better, he could hopefully make some improvements, because Anthony Pettis is so talented and so fun to watch when he's on. The fact that he can come along all this way with all of these like Band-Aids and workarounds, things to cover up, things that cover up fairly noticeable flaws. Like, he's one of the most limited fighters, I think, to ever win a UFC championship. You know what I mean? Like, to have this many holes in his game, and I think he has for a while. He's waiting for these big moments. There's a romance to that, but it's romantic because it's not reliable. You know what I mean? And so making Pettis a reliable fighter is a challenge, but I hope to see it happen. And in the meantime, more than happy to watch Edson Barboza get his due. And with the fine work from Mark Henry, turning him into such a good boxer and such a smart, disciplined fighter has been a real pleasure. So let's take a quick break, Pat. When we come back, we may do a segment suggestion from one of our listeners or a couple questions. We've only got a little bit of time left, so maybe the questions are the right way to go, and then we'll be done. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. Quickly, before we do some questions, we wanted to, well, mostly Pat wanted to talk about a dear friend of his, a young man by the name of Yair Rodriguez, who delivered a knockout of the year contender at UFC 197 when he double flying kicked Andre Fili to the ground, and Andre Fili's consciousness remained standing, and the two were separated for a short time.
Kicked him right upside the damn head, Connor. Right upside the head.
Yeah, with like an upward, it was like a flying soccer kick, the angle he found for it.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Pretty brutal.
It was technically like a jumping switch kick, but it wasn't like it was like an upward arc. It was like a karate kick way more than like a Muay Thai style round kick, because
like a Kyokushin, like a diagonal head kick, very vertical one rather than an arcing kick so much.
Yeah, exactly. So I really wanted to talk about Yair Rodriguez because I think he's an unbelievable talent. Like, first of all, he's only 23, but he's gotten so much better in every single fight since he won the Ultimate Fighter Latin America. Like, I did not think that much of him when he was on the Ultimate Fighter, and I actually picked the other dude, Leonardo Morales, to win that fight. But having seen what he did in that fight and what he's done since then, like, it's just clear to me, like, this is a special dude.
Yeah.
Because it would be one thing if he were just a flashy range striker. Like, they're flashy range strikers in MMA, even one, maybe not as athletic and explosive as Rodriguez is, but, like, flashy range strikers are a dime a dozen. What makes him really special is the wrestling game that he has, the clinch takedown game especially. Like, he can catch a kick and turn it into a trip. He can hit hip tosses. He can hit big throws. All of those things are a possibility. He can hit beautiful reactive doubles. So that gives him a kind of a safety blanket that most pure outside strikers don't ever have. Like, it's what he has that Anthony Pettis doesn't have. Like, think about how much better Anthony Pettis would be if every time you pressured him, he could just grab a hold of the clinch and then he was a threat to hit a disgusting hip toss on you.
Yeah, it makes him more like John Jones than Anthony Pettis. Because John Jones similarly doesn't have much of a boxing game. He has made great strides in that regard recently. But he's really like a classic Muay Thai fighter with heavy wrestling game and grappling, of course. You know, he's long range with the kicks and the straight punches, or he's inside in the clinch, and he doesn't really want you to be between those two. And he has the tools to choose the range. And I'm happy to see that Rodriguez seems to be kind of developing the poise. Like, he has rapid onset experience. He's already kind of developing the know-how to force the range that best suits him, rather than getting stuck in that mid-range very often. I have some reservations about a guy like Yair Rodriguez, just like I do about another very talented prospect in Aljamain Sterling, because I haven't seen the dynamic kicks plus wrestling plus submission wrestling style work that many times. Like, John Jones is obviously the notable example. But who else has really made that style work? I feel like I've seen a lot of those guys fall short.
Well, so I think that it has fallen short for guys, but what sets apart Sterling and Rodriguez from their compatriots is how unbelievably athletic they are. I think even more so Rodriguez than Sterling, who's a crazy good athlete in his own right. Like, in Rodriguez's case, like, he is genuinely one of the 4 or 5 best athletes in a featherweight division that is full of unbelievable specimens.
Yeah.
Like, he is so fast and so long. And like, I think the learning curve too, you have to bear in mind, like, he's only like 4 years into his career.
Yeah,
3.5, 4 years into his career.
It's crazy how young and inexperienced he is. The thing is I look at him, like, I look at a guy like Yair Rodriguez and I look at a guy like Mirsad Bektic, both in the same division, and I think, which of these guys would I put my money on? Which horse would I bet on to make it to or even win a title shot? And I think I'd pick a fighter like Bektic. Like, for example, if these two fought, I think Bektic, even give him a little time, I think Bektic's smooth movement and his multi-layered threats, his ability to pressure, his ability to fight with punches in the pocket as well as in the clinch. I think those things kind of pick apart the pieces of Rodriguez's game. I fear that he could become, despite the wrestling, a bit of an Anthony Pettis, where, yeah, he's crazy athletic, but is he, because he doesn't have to, because he can get away with not developing a boxing game?
But that's a styles make fights thing, right? Like not a,
sure.
Like that's less of a commentary on Rodriguez as a potentially elite fighter than it is as a commentary on the fact that a really sound boxer puncher type with unbelievable takedowns and a vicious top game is going to be a tough matchup for a guy who while he's a good takedown artist, does not have bulletproof takedown defense, and who's probably going to struggle with a guy who has the footwork to pressure him consistently.
Right, but I'm talking about consistent success here. And surely if we're looking at a fighter, the expectation is that if you're coaching a fighter, you're not saying to yourself, he's going to lose the bad style matchups and whatever. You're thinking, how can I equip this guy with enough, how can I equip him well enough and get him enough of the right kind of experience that when the tough matchups start to come along, guys who are kind of purpose-built to beat him, he can fight against type or find the right openings or make his style work against that kind of fighter.
But so let me give you the flip side to this, because we're arguing about two guys whom I love dearly here. Isn't the flip side to that, like, Rodriguez is 3 inches taller and can hurt Bektic from ranges where he absolutely can't touch him? Like, couldn't you look at that and say, how does Bektic get inside against the guy who can kick him from halfway across the ring and then stick and move afterwards? Sure, maybe Bektic gets inside, but but isn't there a chance that he just sticks him at range for substantial portions of a 5-round fight?
I mean, Bektic can catch a kick, and he can feint his way forward, and he can run through Rodriguez's legs when he's crossing his feet, circling the octagon. I just think a lot of a lot of times I see fighters like this, and they're crazy talented, and I worry that they may not develop like that. Because if you look at the way Bektic has been brought along as a fighter, he has been brought along as if he's a workhorse, despite the fact that he is a crazily explosive, powerful athlete. And Rodriguez is being brought along like a dynamic, explosive athlete, not a workhorse. He doesn't have a workhorse style. You know what I mean? He doesn't like.
I don't agree with that at all, man.
Like, you don't think so?
I think that's crazy. Yeah, I think he's a guy who spends a shitload of time drilling wrestling with All-American wrestlers like Mark Perry and going to the University of Illinois wrestling room.
Maybe it's because I love good boxing so much. What I'm really focusing on is his lack of boxing.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I think, would you say that he has not gotten better at that in his last 3 fights? Like, for a guy who was a competitive Taekwondo guy, like, would you not say that he has become a better boxer and has tighter, more precise footwork than he did a year ago?
His footwork's gotten better. I don't know about his boxing. We almost never see him throw punches.
Well, and why is that? Rarely. Think about why is that against a guy in Andre Fili who's a pretty decent pressure fighter and has solid pressure footwork when he puts his mind to it. Why did we not see Rodriguez in punching range?
I don't know. I don't think Andre Fili is the ultimate test of whether or not you're a good enough boxer. I mean, I'm talking about future potential here. I mean, we both agree that for the time being,
there's a reason why he was able to stick a guy who wanted to pressure him and be aggressive completely outside of a punching range where he's pretty good for the 7 minutes before he landed the knockout. Like, I'm not saying that, like, this is not me saying that, yeah, right, Yair Rodriguez is a future champion. He beats Jose Aldo tomorrow. This is me saying that, like, if you're looking at a guy who's 3.5 years, 4 years into his career, who just beat a guy who was, at least on paper, a stylistic matchup that could have posed problems for him with a jumping head kick after never being in trouble. Like,
yeah, the only thing is when I hear, you know, there's a reason that Fili didn't get on him. All I hear in my head is there's a reason Anthony Pettis destroyed Donald Cerrone and Benson Henderson even in 2013. Like, some fighters are just not going to realize how vulnerable you really are. Some fighters are going to be like Daniel Hooker. I picked Hooker over Rodriguez, and it looked really silly in retrospect, but I picked Hooker because I thought he would put a lot of pressure and test what I think is a lacking boxing game of Rodriguez and get in his face and not be scared off. As it turned out, he was scared off. He was completely overawed by the craziness of what Rodriguez does, and that's a great credit to Rodriguez, but that is Anthony Pettis territory. Like, that is a point at which you're going to have to develop the interstitial pieces of your game at some point. For now, he's fine, obviously.
But I want to come back. I want to come back to that one point. Like, what I was getting at was the takedown game. like the reason that Fili got scared off wasn't because Rodriguez was relying on strikes to keep Fili at bay, though he did a good job of using his kicks and then sticking and moving after he threw the kicks. It was because what happened when Fili got really aggressive and lunged forward with a nice punching combination where he had Rodriguez fairly close to the fence. Rodriguez changed levels and blast doubled him off his feet.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about guys like Fili. We don't get too wrapped up in this, but at least people get to hear us have an argument. I'm not talking about guys like Fili. I'm talking about Max Holloway and Mirsad Bektic. I'm talking about guys with fully developed games, confident, poised, well-poised games down the road. If Rodriguez does not develop the things that I think are missing, then they will trouble him. For now, he's obviously fine. Against guys like Andre Fili, he looks like the greatest talent there's ever been. He looks amazing, and that's why both you and I are really high on him. But I have trepidation because you see a guy who is easily able to style on people without developing those pieces. And the wrestling is one of those connecting pieces, but there are going to be some guys who just don't lunge in off balance and let you take them down with a reactive double. I don't think Max Holloway is going to come in flinging himself into the pocket with a knockout punch and get taken off his feet quite as easily as a guy like Andre Fili does. You know what I mean?
But that's the difference between a guy in Max Holloway who's been fighting professionally for 6.5 years and a guy who's been fighting for 3.5 years. There are holes in Rodriguez's game, but looking at where, if you were to look at the Max Holloway who fought Pat Schilling, would you have looked at Holloway and said, you know what, that guy is a mortal lock to eventually destroy Cub Swanson on national TV?
No, but didn't he fight Dennis Bermudez 2 years into his career?
No, he fought
years.
Bermudez 3.5 years into his career.
Yeah, so at the point that Rodriguez is now, he earned a decision over Dennis Bermudez.
That wasn't the Dennis Bermudez. That wasn't like Dennis Bermudez who was destroying. What's his name? Who did Bermudez just murder before he fought before Lamas choked him?
Clay Guida.
Yeah, he was beating
Jimmy
Pettis. We're talking about the Bermudez who was fighting, who was not the guy who was stringing together really gorgeous punch kick combinations and being an insane clinch fighter. That was a different Dennis Bermudez.
He was a crazy clinch fighter against Matt Grice. But anyway, the point is, I have reservations about Rodriguez. We both think he's really talented. I love what he does. I think what he does is really impressive. And we can hopefully have the chance to talk about him more in the future. I think we only have time for one question, though, after all that. So what was... shit, I don't have my heavy bag sound effect ready. Stall, Pat.
I'm stalling. You're wrong about Yair Rodriguez.
Pat,
do you have the sound effect?
I may like weird fighters, but you go to bat for talented fighters. You do that.
Yeah.
You do that.
That's because, generally speaking, when you have a guy who has that kind of talent, who spends his time being trained by Greg Jackson and guys like Izzy Martinez, and who spend their time going and wrestling with All Americans and actually former national champions, they tend to turn out pretty well. That's what I'm basing that on. Is I think that for every potential flaw that you're pointing to, absolutely, yeah, those things can and probably will be problems, and he probably will lose a fight before he eventually reaches the elite. But there's every reason to think that he will get there, as opposed to reasons to think that he won't.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with him losing fights either. That's going to happen, and one of those losses may teach him the lessons I'm talking about. But down the road, it depends on whether he becomes the kind of person who can learn from those lessons, learn from those losses and those tough style matchups or not. Losing doesn't really matter. What matters is career development and being on the right path. So I think we're more or less on the same page. We just I'm a little more I'm reserved. So let's do a question, and you have our question. So after this sound effect, which I'm about to play, I want you to read the question you have for us.
Okay, so this question comes to us from Matt Walsh on Twitter, at mwalshy55.
Sorry about that. What was that name again?
That name is Matt Walsh. The Twitter handle is mwalshy55. So he's wondering who we think is the best pure striker in MMA.
Okay, well, I think that demands us to ask the question, what is a pure striker? Because I think the most successful strikers in MMA these days are probably not what you might consider pure strikers. You know what I mean? You put a lot of these guys in a
true.
boxing match, and they may not do as well as you expect based on their MMA performances.
Yeah, so I think that if we're going to say a pure striker, I would say that's somebody who strikes, who does not mix up their striking with other things, right? So somebody like Robbie Lawler does not, generally speaking, shoot for takedowns. Joanna Jędrzejczyk does not generally shoot for takedowns. I guess Jose Aldo still not a big takedown artist, though he has won fights with his top control in the past, or has used that effectively. So, would you consider Jose Aldo a pure striker in MMA? I'm not sure that I would.
Yeah. Okay, so why wouldn't you? That's my question.
I would say because of the fact that he will use takedowns to win rounds. He did that against Ricardo Lamas. He did that against Jesus. How can I not remember his name?
Canadian guy,
Mark Hominick.
Yeah, because I couldn't remember it either.
He did that against Chan Sung Jung. Whenever he is faced with a matchup where it is worth his energy to take a guy down, Jose Aldo does so. And I'm sure that had we gone past the opening 13 seconds, he would have done so against Conor McGregor too. So I think when you can count on a guy using takedowns as an integral part of his game plan, when that is a viable thing for him to do, you can no longer consider that guy a pure striker.
So does that make Alexander Gustafsson not a pure striker? Because he really relies on those takedowns a lot, actually, to like break rhythm and keep opponents from walking him down. But he doesn't really do a lot.
I would call Alexander Gustafsson a pure striker by this measure.
Okay, so by the criteria you've created, then what would be like? Give me some examples of pure strikers, because I don't think there are many in MMA who really just strike.
So I would say Max Holloway.
Well, you can't be Max Holloway. Max Holloway uses the clinch. Max Holloway's got a bunch of submission wins.
Oh, so we don't include the clinch in striking now?
He's got a bunch of submission wins.
Yeah, and how does he get there?
I can't remember. How did he submit Cub Swanson?
Either takedown counters, or he snaps you down to a front headlock and uses a guillotine sweep.
Okay, so he's not. He doesn't pursue. He uses grappling like to grappling attacks to defend grappling.
Yeah, I would call him a pure striker.
Okay.
I would say that Robbie Lawler is the purest example, and then I would say probably Joanna Jędrzejczyk next.
Yeah, I think Joanna is a great one. That was probably the one that I was going to go for. I think I would probably also say Conor McGregor, because I think Conor McGregor. I think we know very I think we know full well that McGregor does not want to go for takedowns against his opponents. The only two times he has gone for double leg takedowns in the UFC since he's really come into his own as a fighter were when he blew out his knee against Max Holloway and when he was dead to rights against Nate Diaz. And I think otherwise...
He was panic wrestling.
Right. He became a Division I champion panic wrestler. I think otherwise Conor McGregor always looks for striking solutions to the problems in front of him.
Yeah, I agree with that. So I guess I would say my answer is Jędrzejczyk, simply because I think that she is the purest striker and the best one.
Yeah, it's a pretty good one. Maybe... maybe not Dillashaw. He doesn't really do a lot of offensive wrestling.
I think he still looks for it enough when need be that we can't call him a pure striker. And besides, too, he was a Division I wrestler.
Yeah, that's true.
He used to use it a lot more. He's still got that great move to the back that he likes.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting question. I'm caught up in thought of how to define what a pure striker, or maybe is it even a term that we should even use going forward? Should we try to decide who's the best pure striker? Because the more I write about and watch MMA, the more I become interested in fighters who are great in their transitions and fighters who, because even guys like Max Holloway, they're not winning all their fights with striking. You know, like Max Holloway is still a very complete mixed martial artist. He does things very well. He's got a good guard. He's very good in the clinch and fighting on the breaks in ways that you at least can in a lot of striking arts. And he can defend takedowns and work submissions. So, you know, depending on how strict you get with this pure striker thing, he's not a pure striker either, because you can't get away with not threatening in certain areas as a mixed martial artist. You got to have threats everywhere. You know, you got to at least be able to scare someone off in all phases if you want to have consistent success. Well,
exactly, right? Because there are really a couple of different things that we're talking about here. I think it's really hard to be a great striker in MMA. The kind where you look at that fighter putting in work and striking and saying, "Oh wow, there's levels to this shit."
Yeah.
Like without also being like Max Holloway and saying, "Oh, if I fuck up in the clinch, he's going to grab a front headlock, transition to a guillotine, sweep me, end up on top, and then choke the life out of me."
Why did we not mention Edson Barboza and Anthony Pettis either?
Oh shit, yeah. Well, I think because
Pettis wrestles so now, often, but he didn't used to.
Yeah, well, I think that's because Pettis will look for submission finishes. I think in Barboza, I guess probably Barboza. Barboza rarely looks for takedowns.
Yeah, I think Barboza for sure. Like Barboza deals with everything in the way a striker would. Barboza is totally a 6 months of sprawl training kind of fighter. You know what I mean? He's a classic sprawl and brawler, except he's way too technical to be called a brawler.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, he has looked for occasional takedowns. That was what got him in trouble against Tony Ferguson, right? When
true.
He worked that takedown right into the front headlock choke.
But I believe he was also dead tired and possibly a little hurt at that point.
Yeah, so he panic wrestled.
Maybe
he too is a Division I panic wrestler.
Most fighters are, I think. Actually, panic wrestling is. I mean, you can't take a knee in MMA like you can in boxing. You can't say, "Okay, I need a few seconds to collect my thoughts." So I can't fault anybody for panic wrestling. I think you take the option to get knocked down, and you just say you get finished in boxing whenever your back hits the mat, and you'll get some panic clinching happening a lot more often.
Yeah, true. Well, okay. So I don't know. That's an interesting question. Thank you, Matt Walsh, for sending that our direction.
Yes.
We got some good discussion out of that.
Thank you. Yeah. And by the way, people who are pledged to us on Patreon, if you have pledged $5 or more, please go ahead and send us some more questions because we could use some more questions from you guys. I'm sure there's lots of things, upcoming fights. We occasionally get questions about, like, what does the UFC do about Conor McGregor's contract issues and stuff like that. We don't really know how to answer that well.
Or if we did know how to answer that, this would not be the venue for it. I'm happy to talk about it, but I'm going to do that in an article.
Sure,
not
or on Twitter.
Not in a podcast discussion.
Yeah, well, and not on heavy hands. It's the finer points of face punching. Contract negotiations are not the finer points. You can't feint somebody with a contract negotiation, or can you?
I think, does that change the dynamic in Diaz McGregor 2? Find out more on next week's Heavy Hands.
That's right. So send us some more questions. Of course, you guys are always welcome to send us questions with the hashtag HeavyBagQuestions on Twitter. And if we like them, like we did tonight, we will answer them. And otherwise, I think we're out of here. Find us on Twitter, by the way, at Patrick_Wyman, at BoxingBush. That's me. And anything you need to promote before we wrap things up, Pat?
Yeah, so I have a post-fight technical recap of most of the main card fights, everything except for Whitaker Natal, up on Bleacher Report right now. Then I will have a discussion of Anthony Pettis, on the fall of Anthony Pettis, up on the Washington Post on Thursday. And then either Thursday or Friday, depending on the timing, I will have something about the UFC's business in the last couple of years and the precise extent to which their resurgence has been built on Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey.
That sounds awesome. All very interesting. For me, I will be having... Well, I had my Edson Barboza piece, so go check that out. It's called A Warrior's Resolve, How Edson Barboza Beat Anthony Pettis at UFC 197. That's on bloodyelbow.com, of course. And then I'm going to have a piece on Demetrius Johnson's clinch. I call it Mighty Muay Thai, Demetrius Johnson's Killer Clinch, or something along those lines. I love my titles, Pat.
I like it. I like the alliteration, man.
Thank you so very much. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm glad that even in a situation where... first of all, Edson Barboza got the win. You know I'm psyched about that. But I'm also happy for Demetrius Johnson that he was on a card where the main event ended up being the letdown, and he got to be the most exciting part of the main card, bar perhaps Yair Rodriguez's crazy knockout. But still, like, a championship fight ending in that dominant a fashion for a guy with an undeserved reputation for not finishing opponents at this point is always a nice showing. So I was happy to see that. And thank you, everybody, for listening, for tuning in. Thank you for those of you who do for supporting us on Patreon. If you don't, check it out. We're trying to get a Slack going, a Slack discussion board, message board, basically, for people who want to talk to us. $10 a month gets you that, patrons only. And we're going to try to do event discussions. Since we don't do many live cast things, we're going to try and get on there during some events and talk to you guys and answer questions off the air that maybe aren't going to be on the air. All kinds of stuff like that. So $10, and if you are a $10 or more subscriber, or patron and you have not yet sent us your email on Patreon, please do that so we can add you and we can start actually building this little community. And I'm looking forward to it. Thank you once again for everyone joining us tonight. If you came here for the finer point of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.